Hello, and welcome to Virtual Investor Conferences. On behalf of OTC Markets, we're very pleased you have joined our Digital Asset Conference. Our next presentation is from BitcoinTreasury Corporation. Please note you may submit questions for the presenter in the box to the left of the slides, and you can view a company's availability for one-on-one meetings by clicking Book a Meeting. At this point, I'm very pleased to welcome Elliot Johnson. He's the Chief Executive Officer of BitcoinTreasury Corporation, which trades on the OTCQB venture market under the symbol BTCFF and on the TSXV under the symbol BTCT. Welcome, Elliot.
Thanks, John, and thank you everybody who is watching today. It's great to spend some time with you. I'd like to share what we're doing with BitcoinTreasury Corp, perhaps as an introduction to some of you or an update for those of you who've been following us since we went public last year in June. So before I get into BitcoinTreasury Corp, we are a company in Canada being built on top of Bitcoin. I thought it would be worthwhile first to talk about Bitcoin itself, because Bitcoin is the most profound new asset we've seen in our lifetimes. And the emphasis on this is incredibly strong because we're living in a world where fiat currency is declining in value. We've all lived through significant inflation over the past several years. That problem plagues everybody, from individuals to corporations to governments. And without fully appreciating how Bitcoin is the solution to that problem, I think it's quite difficult to see the value that you can generate building a company on top of Bitcoin. But Bitcoin treasury companies are a relatively new sector within the public markets. And there are those of us out here who are trying to pioneer this development of a new company built on top of Bitcoin. So first, let's talk about Bitcoin, why we like Bitcoin so much, why I've been a Bitcoiner since I first discovered it in 2017, and why we think it is a really good asset upon which to build a thriving business for the long term. So those of you who know about Bitcoin are going to know everything that I'm going to talk about here, but just as a recap for everybody, the key thing about Bitcoin is that it is the hardest asset ever created because there is a fixed supply, and yet it is infinitely divisible, so everybody can own it. There is no other asset like that. If you think about gold, gold cannot be easily divided and recombined or moved around the world at the speed of light. But Bitcoin has those properties, which means that Bitcoin is to gold what email was to the Postal Service. It really is a new version, a much better version of a store of value asset. And it really comes down to those properties of being fixed supply and infinitely divisible and built on top of the technology for the internet age. This is a critical point to understand. When I discovered Bitcoin and realized that there can be more participation in the network over time without any dilution to the Bitcoin that I hold, I was sold. Because that's not true in most other assets that you own, where if you own an asset and there needs to be more, if you're a venture investor and there need to be more shares in a company for a larger group of shareholders, it typically involves some form of dilution. But this anti-dilutive property is why so many people have moved towards Bitcoin as a store of value. And yet it has the benefit of that network effect as there is adoption around the world over time. So this is an absolutely critical point. And when you fully appreciate the value of Bitcoin and the elegance of its design, you start to see how it can be a solution to many of the problems that we have today. The other key element to Bitcoin that makes it such a strong asset on which to build a company is that it's not controlled by anybody. And again, this is such a profound and important thing because it's not something that we're used to in our daily lives. When you think about the money that you have in the bank, it's really the money the bank says that you're allowed to have of the deposits that you've made. And really all of that is regulated by the government. But Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer asset where you can take ownership of it yourself. So it can't be controlled by a bank or a government. And it has proven resistant to attempts to control it over its lifetime so far. We really think that this is very critically important at the time that we are right now in the cycle of the currency. Because as time goes by and you have currencies that are weakening and losing purchasing power, it becomes increasingly attractive for governments to try to steal value from their citizens by controlling the currency. So you really do want an asset that's outside of government control. And there are other hard assets out there that don't meet this test, right? Your housing, for example, is not outside of government control. Governments can tax it. You cannot move it. It cannot be sent around the world at the speed of light. It's also true for gold. Gold famously was seized twice last century, once by the UK government at the end of World War I, and again by FDR during the beginning of the Great Depression. But you can't steal a digital asset where the cryptographic control remains in the power of the person who owns it. So one question that comes up all the time when talking about Bitcoin is, well, if Bitcoin has all these properties, why don't we have to worry about there being a second Bitcoin or a third Bitcoin or somebody copying Bitcoin? And this really has to do with what it means to achieve consensus as a store of value asset. And this is where Bitcoin, by being early, by being the first blockchain asset, the first asset to meet this need of digital store of value, has differentiated itself from every other attempt to copy it since then. And that really comes down to the fact that once you have a digital store of value, you do not need a second one. By being infinitely divisible, there's more than enough Bitcoin for everybody in the world to participate. Bitcoin truly is for everybody. And you don't need to say, well, what about the competing digital currency or digital token that perhaps somebody has suggested since Bitcoin has gained adoption? And when you think about it from the standpoint of Bitcoiners and people who have already put some of their value into the Bitcoin network by owning Bitcoin, why would that person want to take the value out of Bitcoin and put it into something else? Because that, by definition, would dilute the value of a single store of value asset. And so it's critically important that we all recognize that Bitcoin has achieved its status as the only digital store of asset. And by being built for the internet age, it's the only one that we need. And we don't need other digital store of value assets. And as more people realize that, greater adoption will happen. And as more adoption happens, increasingly the asset will monetize. Now, I've only touched on this subject of why Bitcoin is so critically important. There are so many great resources out there to find out more if you are new to Bitcoin. But it is absolutely essential that we all accept that Bitcoin is for everybody, and it is not a speculative asset. It is not the same as other digital assets. It is capital forming in real time on the internet. And this is why we are so confident that building a company on top of Bitcoin provides us with the ability to succeed in the long term. Because this is very much like going back to the beginning of electricity or the beginning of the internet. And if you think about what it would have been like back then, if you could see where those innovations were going to go, it was a very obvious business decision to build a company on top of those technologies. There is only one electricity, there is only one internet, and there is only one digital store of value. And building on top of Bitcoin, we think presents an ability for our company to compete with well-established, much larger companies here in Canada. So we are Canada's pure play Bitcoin corporation. We're the fourth largest public Bitcoin holder. The three larger than us are Bitcoin miners. And Bitcoin miners present a very different investment case than a Bitcoin treasury company because the act of mining has very different economics surrounding it in terms of being able to continually upgrade hardware to compete as global hash rate increases over time. That's not what we're doing. We are a balance sheet company. We have a treasury asset. We have 771 Bitcoin. We are looking to grow the amount of Bitcoin we have on a per share basis to drive more value for our shareholders. And we are building Bitcoin services on top of the Bitcoin that we have in order to generate more Bitcoin. We are doing this with a mind to capital preservation, with the growth of our overall reserve of Bitcoin being a goal of the company in the long term. This is important for Canadian equity investors, which is why we brought this company to market back at the summer of last year, because we saw a significant opportunity in the market here for a Bitcoin corporation to exist in Canada, because as I said previously, Bitcoin is for everyone. And so therefore, all investors need to be able to access Bitcoin. And that includes people who are constrained by Canadian equity mandates. If you have an investment mandate where you can only buy Canadian equities, you can't buy ETFs, you can't buy foreign equities, and yet you deserve to have Bitcoin as well as anybody else. So that's why we brought the company to market. We raised money in June and we bought our Bitcoin. We are now building Bitcoin services on top of that. And really, this is about providing digital capital to the world from the Bitcoin that we hold. Our equity, we think of as a way to provide digital equity to the Canadian Stock Exchange. We have convertible debt, which is a form of digital credit, and we're also lending out our Bitcoin to earn more Bitcoin, which is also a form of digital credit. And we think the digital credit market has a massive opportunity to expand in the years ahead as increasingly people realize that Bitcoin is the best collateral asset in the world. We also are embarking upon a digital derivatives program where we're going to be selling call options to monetize some of the price volatility that exists in Bitcoin, again, with the goal of increasing the Bitcoin that we own so that we can increase the amount of Bitcoin there is for each shareholder of the company. The reason we care so much, and this is a super important point, is that we ourselves are large shareholders. We have exceptionally good management alignment. Everybody on the management team bought a significant amount of the stock on our initial offering, and we're taking no salaries. We are in this to grow the amount of Bitcoin per share, and the reason we built the company in the first place was because we already were large holders of Bitcoin on a personal level ourselves. So as with any Bitcoiner, our question was, what can we do now? We already own a lot of Bitcoin, and the answer is we want to own more Bitcoin because we believe that Bitcoin is the strongest asset for the future. The reason that we're able to take no salaries is that this is the same team operating BitcoinTreasury that also operates a business called Evolve ETFs. So Evolve ETFs is an ETF issuer, an asset manager in Canada. It's 8 years old, and we're over $8.5 billion in assets under management. And Evolve is available for sale across the country and has a great network of connections across the Canadian financial system. So we believe that we are well positioned to connect with the Canadian equity investor who desperately needs Bitcoin because there is no other way for them to access it other than through the public markets. That being said, we have been working on Bitcoin since 2021 under Evolve ETFs, where we launched one of the world's first Bitcoin ETFs back in 2021. And yet it is still very early in Bitcoin adoption here in Canada. Most institutions do not yet own Bitcoin. Most advisors do not yet own Bitcoin. It's still a minority of the do-it-yourself investors who own Bitcoin, and it is still very early days. And so I think this is true across the world as far as Bitcoin adoption goes. But just because Canada has had Bitcoin ETFs for longer than the US doesn't necessarily mean that we have more penetration and more adoption. But this is a story that we've been telling to the Canadian market now for 5 years, and we are looked to as a group of people who are thought leaders on Bitcoin itself. So the question, of course, then is, well, why invest now? And there are a few catalysts right now that shareholders are looking at when they consider our company. The first big one is that we're currently trading at a discount to the net asset value of the Bitcoin that we hold. You can see our metrics on our website at btctcorp.com. Click on the dashboard button or go to treasury.btctcorp.com to see all of the metrics of our shares outstanding and the amount of Bitcoin that we hold and our net asset value. We believe as Bitcoin sentiment improves and as the sentiment around the Bitcoin treasury sector improves, that we will be traded more closer to fair value. And we also have a shelf prospectus if we end up in a situation where we're trading at a premium. So we have all of the tools at our disposal to grow the amount of Bitcoin that we have on a per share basis. We also have implemented a buyback program. We believe that while we are trading at a discount, that our stock represents good value, so we ourselves are buyers. By buying back our shares, that increases the growth of Bitcoin on a per share basis. And so we're very excited to be able to do that to, again, drive Bitcoin per share growth for investors based on the market sentiment around our stock specifically. We're a pioneer in Canada, and I'll show you on the next slide. We think that the return on invested capital for owning Bitcoin puts us in a tremendously strong competitive position as it compares to other equities within the country. And we also believe that other companies are going to follow us as adopting Bitcoin as a treasury asset, because every company that has any treasury reserve whatsoever faces the problem of inflation, faces the problem of declining purchasing power of the cash that they hold on their balance sheet. And we think that over time, it will be inevitable that investors and the CFOs of companies are all going to seek a hard asset as a place to store their value rather than just simply holding treasuries or cash. This is an adoption trend we've been following very closely. If you follow Bitcoin, you'll see it's been an absolutely transformative 2 years. We hit an all-time high towards the end of last year in the price of Bitcoin, driven by adoption from nation states, for example, the US as a strategic reserve, from institutions who have been adopting Bitcoin since the US got ETFs back in 2024, corporations and individuals. Adoption is continuing because, again, debasement is the problem, but increasingly Bitcoin is gaining recognition as the solution to that. So we have a differentiated opportunity for Canadian investors. This is where we saw that there was a gap in the market in Canada. This is where we saw that there was a need for Bitcoin in a corporate structure within Canada. We offer Bitcoin where we can have it available for Canadian mandates, in brokerage accounts, in Canadian regulated structure, and we have the ability to grow the amount of Bitcoin we have on a per share basis, which is not the case if you're owning just an ETF. As I mentioned previously, the 5-year Bitcoin return beats the return on invested capital of most of the TSX 60 constituents in Canada. This really puts you at a huge competitive advantage when you consider how much bigger the large companies are in Canada and how many products they have to sell to get to an ROIC that is similar to just simply holding Bitcoin. In fact, it's probably rational for many companies to stop what they're doing, sell their assets, buy Bitcoin, and allow Bitcoin itself to drive their business forward. And so we think that this will prove to be a pioneering opportunity that people will look to the success that we have in terms of thinking about how they run their business and how they operate their balance sheets going forward. So how do we do this? Well, as I mentioned, we're going to accretively accumulate Bitcoin, and we're going to deploy it across a range of financial services to institutional clients because we are seeking to be a balance sheet company. This will allow us to monetize our holdings and build compounding shareholder value. Our goal is to have positive cash flow to be able to cover the small costs of the business and accretively grow the amount of Bitcoin that we have, such that over time, our company becomes more valuable on a per share basis as we increase the amount of Bitcoin that each shareholder represents. So we're starting out by building a lending business. We put this in place towards the end of last year. We started out by building out rigorous underwriting standards, looking at the liquidity and liabilities of counterparties that we can lend to. And we are only lending to very, very high quality institutions. We are not looking to build a retail lending business. We are looking to only lend to very high quality institutions where we feel very confident that our Bitcoin will be returned and that the institution can service the debt. This is because we want to safely grow the amount of Bitcoin that we have. We don't want to take large amounts of risk and risk impairing the amount of Bitcoin that we hold in exchange for trying to seek a higher return. Because at the end of the day, we are low time preference, long-term investors seeking to have a positive business that over time will benefit from the adoption of Bitcoin and Bitcoin's growth around the world. The second business element, as I mentioned before, is what we call our price risk management program or our digital derivatives program. This is where we're selectively using options to monetize Bitcoin's volatility. We have a very deep background in this from our asset management business, and we really seek to ensure that we are taking on the minimal amount of call risk while being able to capture the premium that's available in the market for selling volatility against the amount of Bitcoin that we have. The goal of the program is to, again, increasingly increase the amount of Bitcoin that we have on a per share basis. We are not looking to sell away the upside. We are not looking to reduce the amount of Bitcoin that we have. But these are some two obvious tools, digital credit and digital derivatives, that combined will seek to generate positive cash flow for the company, positive Bitcoin for the company, to increase the value of the digital equity, which is the common shares of the business. So why should you consider BTCT now? As I mentioned before, we're trading at a discount to our net asset value. So we ourselves are buyers of our stock at the current levels. We have multiple levers to increase our Bitcoin per share. At a discount, we can buy back our shares. If we trade at a premium, we have a shelf prospectus to allow us to issue more equity in order to buy Bitcoin, which will be accretive on a per share basis. We have a lending program to grow more Bitcoin from the Bitcoin that we have. And we are monetizing the price volatility of Bitcoin through our digital derivatives program. All of these are the levers that we are looking to pull to increase the amount of Bitcoin for every shareholder because we ourselves are shareholders of the company. We built this company in order to increase the amount of Bitcoin that we individually each hold as the management team. We are not taking salaries, and we are able to do this and have a very long-term time preference because we also operate another business where we can be paid for our time for operating that business. So we don't need to take value out of BTCT. In fact, BTCT is the vehicle that we built to accrete more value for all the shareholders of the company, and we are extremely well aligned. And so I'll leave you with this moment and again, ask you please, go to our website at btctcorp.com. You can find us on the TSX Stock Exchange, TSX Venture, BTCT is the ticker, or on the OTCQB Exchange, BTCFF as our ticker there. We invite you also to reach out to talk to us personally or through the meeting opportunity here with OTC Markets. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. I do have some questions I see in the chat that I'm going to go through, and but I would first, before that, just like to thank the OTC Markets for the opportunity to talk with you today. It's great to be associated with OTC Markets, and I'd like to thank very much everybody involved there. So the first question here is, why do you think you're trading at a large discount to NAV, and what are the catalysts to close the gap? So I think there are a few reasons that we're trading at a significant discount to NAV. The first, and I think most rational reason why any company would trade at either a premium or a discount to the net asset value is whether or not the management team has yet delivered on the promise to increase the value of the asset that they hold. We're still a very young company. We're barely 6 months old since we went public. As I mentioned, we put a lot of things in place since we went public, including setting up our shelf prospectus, setting up our buyback program, setting up a lending program, and initiating the start of a digital derivatives program. But until those things bear fruit, I think the market is pricing us at a discount until they can see that we prove that we're able to increase our Bitcoin per share growth. That's one element. I think the other element has to do with sentiment. There were a number of Bitcoin treasury companies that went public last year around the world, and some of them ended up trading at very significant discounts on low liquidity prior to closing of their offerings. We didn't go public that way here at BTCT. We actually went public much more through a more traditional IPO timeline, even though we were an RTO structure. And that timeline meant that other than the management team, every investor was free to trade on the first day that our stock went public. And we had some investors who were hoping for a quick trade, hoping for an immediate pop. And as that pop didn't happen, they started to sell. These were not long-term investors. These were short-term investors. And as I mentioned, we are Bitcoiners. We have very low time preference. We are very long-term in our investment thesis. And so I think over the past 6 months, we've seen a cycling out of the short-term investors to the long-term investors. And I think as that cycling out exhausts itself and we find a shareholder group that is aligned with management's long-term time horizon, we'll see a change in the balance between buying and selling of our stock. And as I mentioned, the catalyst to close the gap, they very much are us delivering on the growth in Bitcoin per share through our operations, along with sharing our story more broadly. We were very much in a quiet period in Canada after we went public because we were waiting for our prospectus to be approved by the regulators. But as today, with this presentation, along with many others that we're doing here in Canada, we're really excited to be still in the early days of bringing our story to the investing market here in Canada. And I think as we bring our story to more investors, and there's increasing interest in our stock, that we will much more accurately reflect the value of the Bitcoin that we hold in our inventory reserve. Another question here, how do you define your long-term business model beyond Bitcoin ownership? I hope I've touched on this through the course of the presentation, but maybe just to zoom out a little bit and step away just from lending and derivatives. I think the real key here is that Bitcoin, by being the world's greatest asset, is going to increasingly find its way into the financial system. We spend a lot of time talking with bankers, especially those here in Canada, and the Canadian banks are only just now really starting to investigate digital assets and really starting to understand Bitcoin and how Bitcoin can work within their businesses. So we're very, very early days. And you're going to need changes in regulation, changes in capital treatment of Bitcoin, changes in all kinds of different ways in which Bitcoin is used as a reserve asset within the financial system before we get the future that Bitcoin will bring to us, which is overall a much more sound financial system built on top of a hard asset that can be held by everybody. As that future comes closer to us, it's going to be increasingly valuable to be a company that has a large reserve of this asset, because there is only 21 million. There can never be any more. And over time, as more people want to own Bitcoin, the price will go up, which means that it will become increasingly difficult for latecomers to accumulate as much Bitcoin as we have. They will need to spend more dollars on it as the dollar declines in value versus Bitcoin itself. So we think that that's going to open up massive opportunities for us to utilize our balance sheet for people who need Bitcoin and don't have access to it, but need it because it becomes adopted increasingly as a collateral and reserve asset across all forms of our financial system. And so again, this is one of these things that may seem like it's a faraway dream, but I remember when the first phones came out that were smartphones. I mean, in fact, the first BlackBerry was a Canadian company that was really the first kind of smartphone available in the world. And then we had the iPhone in 2007 and Android phones that followed, and the world changed. And it changed in so many ways that people at that time in the late 1990s couldn't predict. We couldn't predict that it was going to disrupt taxis, that it was going to disrupt hotels with things like Airbnb, that it will change completely how you communicate with your family and friends. These are all changes that came from the innovation, but there was enough in that adoption to see that it was valuable at the time. And I feel like that's where we are right now with Bitcoin. And so I think that having a company that's built on top of this asset, there's an enormous amount of opportunity for us as more adoption comes to Bitcoin through increasing amounts of institutions, governments, and other entities choosing it. And I think, as I said up front, Bitcoin is for everyone. Everyone deserves to have Bitcoin. We believe our company is going to help that along. We believe that we are providing a way in which Bitcoin can be integrated into the portfolios of people in Canada who must own Canadian equities. And we think we're very competitive with other Canadian equities who have not yet realized the value that Bitcoin can bring to their business. And so with that, I'd like to thank you again for spending time with me today. I look forward to hearing more from you. I just have a couple of other questions. I just saw them in the chat here. Are non-Canadians allowed to buy? Yes, you can buy via the OTC markets, ticker BTCFF. What could be an approximate proportion of Bitcoin inventory that the written calls could potentially represent? We would like to use as much of our inventory as possible, so long as we're able to have our call writing program up and running to the point where we believe that we are not risking any loss of our Bitcoin. And so over time, we'll be providing further updates on our call program. Can you speak to the competitive positioning versus Bitcoin ETFs and closed-end funds? Hopefully I've answered that. The real difference is that we are looking to increase the amount of Bitcoin per share, whereas a Bitcoin ETF has the same amount of Bitcoin over time. One question, who is on your management team and how are you compensated? You can find our management team on our website at btctcorp.com. We are compensated by some very long-term incentive compensation through warrants on our stock. Those warrants only vest if we're able to meet growth targets on our Bitcoin per share, as well as growth on the total value of our Bitcoin that we hold in inventory. And so we're very much aligned with only getting direct compensation when all shareholders have already had success in terms of the growth of the Bitcoin that we hold. Question here, you say you want to earn Bitcoin on Bitcoin. Have you looked into Lightning routing? Yes, we have. Layer 2, it's a very exciting place right now for Bitcoin, and we believe that there's a huge opportunity there as Bitcoin becomes a medium of exchange asset. So it's definitely on our long-term time horizon. We are starting to investigate that now, and we want to see enough liquidity in that space that it makes sense for us to use some of our assets. So it's definitely on our roadmap to look at the possibility there. And then the final question, what's the current market cap of the company? I don't have the direct number off the top of my head. It's somewhere close to about 60 million Canadian dollars. But again, if you go to our website at treasury.btctcorp.com is our dashboard, you can see that information there. And I think I'm right on time then. So that was a perfect number of questions. Thank you once again, everybody who has attended today. Thank you, OTC Markets. And I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Thanks very much.